What's up, everybody? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden, and this episode is the episode I was promising you guys yesterday or the day before. I'm reading Matt Taibbi's book, The Divide, and I finished the first chapter yesterday, and I'm almost done with the second chapter now, so we're going to go over really briefly the synopsis of the first chapter. I also want to tell you guys that I am working on getting the sound fixed. I know that for some people they've been saying if they're wearing their headphones it's a little bit loud, or I need to up the sound and get background noise taken care of. It's expensive, guys. Like, I don't have a lot of money just sitting around to buy an adapter for my iPhone and then hook it up to my mic. I'm working on it. I assure you it's coming. So let's talk about The Divide. Here's the book right here. Awesome. I found it at the library for 50 cents. They have a bookstore in the basement. And the first chapter is all about the 2008 financial crisis and the crash, and how none of the bankers that caused the subprime mortgage crisis to happen ever were jailed. And then there's also the second half of the chapter is largely about an individual man, a guy that was like semi-homeless who spent like a half a year at Rikers Island, New York, which is just a ruthless penitentiary, for having half of a joint of marijuana in his pocket. So he's trying to show how you can get away with absolutely financial murder and crash economies and have your bank laundering money for drug cartels and basically committing all types of financial crime that ruins lives and literally causes death across the globe. And as long as you have enough money at your disposal, you will never get prosecuted by the Fed. So he talks first about, Taibbi talks first about the Holder Memo. Now, the Holder Memo, Eric Holder is who it's named after. He was in the Clinton administration. This memo came out in 1999, and then he was later Attorney General under Barack Obama. And the memo basically was a set of guidelines for federal prosecutors on how they should gauge whether or not they're going to take on a large corporation for financial crimes. And two of the guidelines in particular really allow de-incentivization for prosecutors to actually go after very large corporations like these banks. And the two that I'm talking about specifically are, I'm going to read to you actually from the book, are a lot of these companies, they use like a human shield tactic. And Eric Holder says in the memo basically, be careful if you go after large corporations with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of employees, because if you go after the CEOs and you jail everybody and the company goes under, that you'll be actually affecting collateral damage on a whole bunch of employees and stakeholders who, have an interest in the company and their livelihoods ride on that company not going under. So big corporations count on this human shield, so that they can operate with impunity, because if you take them down, they argue and they'll plead that you'll just put hundreds of or tens of thousands of people out of work. The second part of the Holder Memo that was important was it allows prosecutors to not prosecute certain corporations if their CEOs, and many of them have this, have clauses built into their contract that allows them to use their corporation's financial funds to defend them in court instead of their personal funds. So that de-incentivizes prosecutors, because that means that they can use, sometimes, these companies make billions of dollars, if not tens of billions of dollars a year. If they're allowed to use their company's funds to defend them in court, it means it's almost impossible to beat them, because they can just knock you down and drag you out forever, because they have infinite funds to defend themselves. So between these two things, it really de-incentivizes federal prosecutors going after the banks, because they can defend themselves forever in court. And if you win, a lot of times these things will go out of business and tens of thousands of jobs will be lost. Worse than that, as he goes on to talk about in the chapter, if you lose, a lot of times it, as a lawyer, it goes on your record and follows you around forever, and it can be quite embarrassing for you as the person who lost this very large lawsuit and got embarrassed. So it's a lose for federal prosecutors when they started, following these guidelines, and it made sure that it was almost impossible for federal prosecutors to go after enormous corporations. So let me read to you exactly those two from the book. One's on page 50 and the other one's on page 17 from the Holder memo. One factor the prosecutor may weigh in assessing the adequacy of a corporation's cooperation is the completeness of its disclosure, including, if necessary, a waiver of the attorney-client and work production protections. Another factor to be weighed by the prosecutor is whether the corporation appears to be protecting its culpable employees and agents. Thus, while cases will differ depending on the circumstances, a corporation's promise of support to culpable employees and agents through the advancing of attorney's fees may be considered by the prosecutor in weighing the extent and value of a corporation's cooperation. And Taibbi says, translated into English, what this meant was that a company could push the Justice Department into a charge filing mode just by refusing to waive attorney-client privilege or by paying its employees legal fees. This concept would give prosecutors powerful weapons in their negotiations with companies, essentially forcing them to lay down their shields even before the battle started. And then here's the other one. It's on the next page. One of the other factors in determining whether to charge a natural person or corporation is whether the likely punishment is appropriate given the nature and seriousness of the crime. In the corporate context, prosecutors may take into account the possibly substantial consequences to a corporation's officers, directors, employees, and shareholders, many of whom may, depending on the size and nature, e.g. publicly versus closely held, of the corporation and their role in its operations, have played no role in the criminal conduct, have been completely unaware of it, or have been wholly unable to prevent it. And then Taibbi elaborates, this was a dully written but entirely reasonable sounding proposition. All Holder was saying was that when prosecutors were looking at a big company that might be guilty of criminal conduct, it was okay for them to look at the innocents as well. This is the human shield thing I'm talking about. So that's why, in a nutshell, these CEOs and these very wealthy bankers and billionaires, no matter what they do, even if they do such egregious fraud and embezzlement and every banking crime known on the planet as they did with the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, they'll never see the inside of a jail cell because of these two things, and they came basically from the Holder memo. The second half of the chapter is all about a guy who is, he's in and out of homes, basically crashes on friends' couches, doesn't have a home of his own, and he would basically bounce between his friends' houses and his mom and his pop, and they would kick him out after a while, and he was kind of a tweaker. And then once his mother and father died, he was basically homeless, and he lived in New York City, and he got busted sleeping on a park bench past the 1 a.m. curfew. Like, you had to be out of the public park by then. It was like 5 in the morning. Cops came by, told him to get up and leave. He got up and said, okay, I'm going. And the cops basically, like, wrote him a citation for doing nothing wrong, even though he was just sleeping there. And he started to get belligerent with the cops. And while they were arresting him, they found a half a joint of marijuana in his pocket. And then he spent, I think it was 4 or 5 months at Rikers Island for that roach that they found, simply because he was mouthing off for a citation he never should have gotten because he wasn't actually breaking the law for them to do a citation on him. But as we know, guys, a lot of these police departments, and we have evidence that they did this in New York, have quotas. They basically will go out and do a lot of these citations that are easy, like low-level drug offenses and traffic violations, and they don't do a lot of other things. And the main people that go down 88% of the time, I think he says, in these types of citations and violations are people of color. So the next episode is called Frisk and Stop, and I imagine he's going to go into a lot more detail in that chapter about the opposite side of the spectrum. That will answer the question, why is it that poor people so easily can see the inside of a jail cell, in contrast to what Chapter 1 talks about, which is exactly why it's so difficult to make any of these large CEOs, billionaires, enormously wealthy elitists see the inside of a jail cell. They use human shield, which are their employees, and they often have infinite money provided them by their own company to defend themselves in court. So it makes it financially impossible to go after them. And if you actually win, likely the PR will be very bad, because a lot of times you end up putting in 10,000 or 20,000 people out of work that worked at one of these big financial corporations or banks. So it's a lose-lose, and it's even worse than that for most lawyers, because it's a very complicated type of system. It's very difficult to go after and prosecute these large banks on stuff like this. It takes a lot of time, hundreds of people sometimes working all the time to actually go after them, and still a lot of the times you'll end up losing because they have infinite resources at their disposal. So the next episode on this will probably be in a couple of days. I'm not sure how long it'll take me to read this chapter. Probably not long. The first chapter was awesome. The book's great so far, but it was like 50 some odd pages. This one's much shorter, so in the next 2 days I'll be doing chapter 2 of Matt Taibbi's The Divide. Thanks for tuning in, guys. So if you ever wondered why it was that we can't go after these big bankers and why no one was jailed, the Holder memo and the reasons I just gave you. I'll talk to you later.